Chapter 2, Visiting Hours.
I was teaching a community college class in literature when, to keep the students and myself interested, we looked at the mystery genre and how it developed from Edgar Allan Poe and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and on. I signed books by Agatha Christie, for example. I was rereading Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon to prepare for class when I noticed the 1929 copyright. I had what I call a light bulb moment. It occurred to me that The Maltese Falcon had appeared the same year as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This meant Sam Spade and Al Capone were contemporaries. The movie Chinatown and a couple of TV series and a few novels showed that writing mysteries about the private eye in the 30s or 40s period was a possibility. This meant that a classic private eye like Philip Marlowe could be viewed in an historical context. I could insert my detective, my private eye, Nathan Heller, into history to participate in and often solve a real crime, a true crime that's either been controversially solved or has gone unsolved. I'd grown up reading Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Mickey Spillane, and had an ambition to write that kind of story myself. But by the 1970s, the private eye felt played out. Didn't seem to work in the traditional Humphrey Bogart, fedora, and trench coat kind of way, not in a late 20th century world where Vietnam, student protests, and political assassination held sway. Eventually, some other writers figured out a way to do the private eye in a later era than the 30s or 40s. Robert B. Parker did a sort of yuppie PI, Sarah Paretsky, a female PI with feminist leanings. Stephen Cannell shifted James Garner from the classic Western maverick into the contemporary Rockford Files. But my method was to take a time machine back to the era when the private detective was a real thing, not just in pop culture, but in the real world. The crimes I was looking at, for example, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, the Huey Long political assassination, and yes, the murder of Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, required a bigger sweep than a typical 50 or 60,000 word mystery novel provides. Also, the private eye of fiction is a sort of fantasy figure, and Nathan Heller needed to be more real than that. So the first Heller, True Detective, was over 100,000 words. And Heller had a backstory, a life that had some reality, a family history including a father who'd killed himself with Nate's gun. I'm a Midwestern boy. I've lived in Iowa my entire life. But Chicago was the big city closest to us. My cousins lived in a Chicago suburb, and my family often took post-Christmas getaway vacations to Chicago. Getaway is an apt word, because in the 1930s, the Midwest is where outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, and Pretty Boy Floyd operated, and gangsters like Al Capone and Frank Nitti. And Nate Heller has dealt with all of them. Another factor was the Untouchables TV series with Robert Stack, which I loved as a kid. And that exciting show was based on reality, though I now know it was only loosely based on fact, impressed me. When the real Eliot Ness turned up in my True Detective research, I leapt at the chance to use him. Most are real. Nate Heller is fictional, and his girlfriend Janie is too. She works in the very real county treasurer's office at Chicago City Hall. But Dr. Ranga really did exist, and Louis Campagna is a real mob figure of the period. Little New York Campagna, not surprisingly, hailed from New York, specifically Brooklyn, where he and Al Capone as young men were part of the notorious 5 Points gang. He did time for a bank robbery before moving to Chicago and becoming Capone's bodyguard. Campagna was considered particularly loyal and good with a gun. After Capone's imprisonment for tax evasion, Little New York was Frank Nitti's top lieutenant. That he might rouse and then haul Heller to take him to Dr. Ranga's hospital where the wounded Nitti was waiting is entirely credible. And Campagna was indeed present at the Nitti raid. After the two Harrys raided Nitti's office and nearly assassinated him, the aftermath found Eliot Ness interviewing the witnesses at the crime scene. That was something I got from newspaper research, and it made me very happy. Some of the inaccurate books on Ness indicated the Untouchable had left Chicago immediately after Capone's incarceration. Like so much said and written about Eliot Ness, that was wrong. He does, but not in every one, only when it makes sense to use Eliot Ness. Essentially, when he really was part of the crime I'm looking at through Nate Heller's eyes. To some degree, he plays the Pat Chambers role to Mike Hammer, that is, the privatized police contact. Ness is perhaps the most misunderstood and misrepresented figure in the history of American law enforcement. Television and the Brian De Palma movie have blown his role out of proportion, but latter-day historical revisionists have downplayed that role ridiculously. Ness, working at various times for the Treasury Department and the Department of Justice, was selected as part of a two-pronged effort to take Capone down prior to the coming Chicago World's Fair. He was to bedevil Capone by hitting the outfit's illegal beer racket, chiefly hitting breweries, with his hand-selected team of Prohibition agents who later became known as the Untouchables. The point was to cripple Capone's cash flow. It is untrue that Ness was a press hound. That was part of the revisionism. The Untouchables didn't even become generally known in Chicago till Capone went to trial. Ness built a massive case against Capone on prohibition charges, but the federal government instead went with the work of the other prong, the IRS agents, including Frank Wilson and Elmer Ire, because prohibition was unpopular and on the way out. Later, Ness was very much a crime buster in Cleveland, Ohio, where he became the youngest public safety director in the city's history.